Okay, and now we've resorted to a basement workshop. The light's not quite as good as I could wish, but it's adequate, and I brought another lamp down so we can move the lamp around and get good light anywhere we need it. So today, the reason we came down here instead of working out in the outside undercover was it got real foggy and misty and moisty this morning and cool, quite cool. So today's project is to clear coat the deck, a super thin coating. Epoxy, the thinner it is, the longer it takes to set up. And I didn't want to get a discoloration, a whitish blush. If it's too moist outside and a lot of moisture gets into the epoxy as it's being spread or setting up, sometimes it'll turn a little bit white and you won't get the true natural wood color through it. So I wanted to avoid that. That's because of the cold and damp outside. That's why I brought it inside into the furnace workshop, so it's slightly heated in here. Now what we've done so far, the coaming turned out splendidly. It looks just great. Perfect job on that. So good job. And then we've sanded any, there were a couple of places where a little epoxy got on one of the clamps where it was holding the coaming together. We sanded off that spot and sanded off any fingerprints that we got on the coaming while we were putting it together. So now the coaming's real clean. We started with 150 grit on that and then went to 220 grit, smoothed it out with 220 grit. And now, and then a few spots on the deck itself. I think we don't need the music right now. That's good. But my fingerprint won't work through the gloves. Okay, so now having sanded everything nicely, and we've sanded the whole deck with 220 grit, when you see the deck, it'll look smooth, but there'll be little wood fibers sticking up, and so you have to sand quite thoroughly with the 220 to get those wood fibers sanded smooth. Otherwise the epoxy will coat those wood fibers and it'll leave a very prickly, almost rough surface. And of course it sands, but it's much easier to sand the wood fibers before they're coated with epoxy. Epoxy's tough stuff. And so sand the deck very thoroughly with 220 grit. Of course you can't push too hard because you still have things not totally secure with epoxy. But get it nice and smooth and get any marks off the outside and inside of the coaming, because we'll be coating the outside of the coaming, the inside of the coaming, and the deck, and then we'll be running our fillet along between the coaming and the deck. And so this fill along the edge went very nicely. That looks really good all along the edge inside the carbon fiber tube and the deck. But we do want to wipe that down with acetone. And I also want to show you one detail. I think you saw how we were brushing out bubbles on the on that fill, and there are going to be inevitably quite a few bubbles there. And if you don't brush them out, you know, there'll be bubbles in the surface and it won't be a smooth surface. So we brushed them out initially with the same brush we were using with the epoxy, but then we came back a little bit later after the epoxy was starting to set off. It was still, if you put your finger in it, you'd still come out with you know, epoxy all over your finger, gooey epoxy all over your finger, but it wasn't quite as liquid as before. And then we took a dry brush. This is just a cheap 1-inch brush. We took a dry brush and just very lightly as possible, just drag those bristles over the epoxy while it's still wet, but not, you know, not totally liquid. And those bubbles, all the bubbles come to the surface because they float. You know, they're lighter than the epoxy. And as you drag the brush over the bubbles, it'll just burst the bubbles. And if you're getting it just at the right time, those bubbles, the crater of the bubble formed by the bubble, will just fill back in with the epoxy. It's still liquid enough that the crater will fill back in and create a smooth surface. So that's an important step. And you may want to do that more than once. If your bristles of the brush are sticking in the epoxy, you're probably a little bit early on that step. But if you wait too long, then you may burst the bubbles, but they won't fill back in, and you'll still have a rough surface. Okay, and now, because when we coat the deck, we're going to be, you know, we don't need to recoat the edge, but it's easier, you know, we will get over the epoxy we've already got on the edge here a little bit. And so we want to wipe everything, all the edge down with acetone, and make sure we get off the amine blush, because epoxy doesn't like to stick to the amine blush. So wipe that down thoroughly, and you can see quite a bit of stuff's coming off. And I did vacuum. Make sure you don't have any dust on the deck too, because dust will cause little bumps in the epoxy that'll have to be sanded out later as well. So you can tack rag your deck. I actually vacuumed it so that got all the dust off the deck. And as soon as we get this edge wiped down, the reason we're using acetone, not water, is we don't want to get the wood wet with water. Even if we had time to let it dry before starting to work on it, if we get the wood wet with water, it'll raise the grain up, and we'll have to sand it again to get it smooth. So acetone is ideal. It evaporates instantly and takes the amine blush off. Okay, we'll be back. We'll mix up some epoxy, and then we'll be back. The goal on this deck is to get a super thin coating. We don't want any accumulation at all. We really don't want any epoxy on top of the wood. We just want the epoxy left that's soaked into the wood to make the surface of the wood a little bit harder. If we get a buildup of epoxy on top of the wood, it's going to take a lot more sanding, and we're adding unnecessary weight. We're going to be varnishing several coats of varnish on top of the epoxy, and varnish is much easier to get a perfect finish on than epoxy. So super light. We'll be squeegeeing almost all the epoxy back off after we coat the deck. Oh, one other point with the squeegees. You probably saw this in the other video, but the squeegees, here's the one. This is the one with teeth. The squeegees can be cleaned off. This isn't quite as brittle as I would like to clean it off, but you can see the epoxy doesn't stick to the squeegees. It won't either clean off the squeegee really thoroughly with a paper towel while the epoxy is still really wet, or else let it set up. You can see all those teeth are coming. I don't know, maybe you can't see. Get the light right. All those teeth are coming completely clean of epoxy. So don't throw your squeegees away just because they're covered with epoxy. Just wait till the epoxy sets up enough that you can crack and peel it off. The squeegee will bend a lot more than the epoxy will once the epoxy is hard. So so by bending the squeegee dramatically, the epoxy will pop off. This epoxy is still a little rubbery, so it makes it a little harder to get off, but I'll be able to get that clean as well. Okay, so we'll want a clean squeegee for the job this morning. Run your finger along the edge of that squeegee, the clean squeegee. Make sure it's totally clean. You have just one little bump of epoxy on the edge of your squeegee, and it's going to create every time you drag it, your squeegee over the new epoxy, it's going to create a groove in the epoxy and an uneven surface. So make sure your squeegee edge is perfect. You can even, if you do have some irregularity in your squeegee edge, you can just take a piece of 220 sandpaper, lay it on the table, and just rub the edge of the squeegee back and forth on the sandpaper until you have a perfect edge. Don't use a coarser sandpaper, but 220 or anything finer will work fine to clean up the edge of a squeegee. Okay, we're going to mix the epoxy, and then we'll be back in just a minute. Only mix 2 large marks at a time, because we're spreading this so thin it doesn't take much epoxy, and if you mix more epoxy initially, it's going to start to set off in your pot, and it won't spread easily. It won't spread as smoothly and thin. And then another observation, along this edge here is really the only place you want a fairly heavy coating, because you want the epoxy to sink in between these two pieces, between your deck and your coaming piece. So coat it initially quite heavily, and it'll sink right in, and then squeegee off the excess. The other thing is, when you're squeegeeing, always squeegee, never squeegee across the grain. Always squeegee lined up, just like brushing. Always squeegee lined up with the grain. And because the squeegee is going to leave little, almost imperceptible groove marks in the epoxy in the surface. And as long as those are lined up with the grain, they won't show. So any accumulation along the edge, just dry your brush off by wiping it off thoroughly on the edge of the container, and then brush that out along the edge where you can't really squeegee very easily. Okay, but the goal is twofold: keep the boat ultra light and minimize the sanding, so so you don't have to sand too much. Okay, I think that's and you can see we're moving along quite nicely. See if we have a little bit more here. When you place it, brush it out a little bit, and then when you squeegee it, you're going to find you have a lot more coverage than what you can get with the brush. Make sure you don't leave any dry spots. You don't want to do that. The color won't blend. Okay, and then squeegee it out, and you get almost twice the coverage. So we're way up here with the squeegeeing out here. And get the light, get the reflection off the surface so you can see what you're doing. Without reflection off the surface, you really can't tell what you've got, where you've got an accumulation and where you haven't got any, where you've missed it. Okay, looking good, going great. Okay, now we've mixed up 4 large marks of epoxy. We're getting ready to do the fillet along the coaming, but first we're going to use, we've got it a little bit runnier than we want for the fillet perhaps. Yeah, a little bit runnier, but we want it pretty liquid. Here, let me show you what we've got. See, it's not, you know, it's pretty liquid. It's got a lot of silica in it, admittedly, but we might want it a little, and this might be good for the coaming, we'll see. But first we want to fill in right around our loop here at the bow, and we want it to be self-leveling here. We don't want to get epoxy up on the loop where it's come out of the deck, and a little bit of a gap here as we go back. I'll clean that off there in a minute, but that's too big a gap for the clear epoxy to fill, so we'll use a little bit of the pre-thickened. So we're being careful not to get the epoxy up on the strap. We want it to we want the strap to be flexible where as soon as it emerges from the boat. So we're just kind of gently pushing the epoxy in, and this epoxy is going to be self-leveling. It's going to sag just enough to fill this gap in really nicely and give us a smooth surface. If this was too thick, if I'd put in too much silica powder here, this would not be working so easily. Just kind of nudging it a little bit, but it's going to move by itself because I didn't put too much silica in. Okay, it's going to level itself and flow forwards in between those straps just right. If it's going down too much, if it's sinking in too much, we won't have enough of a surface, and we'll add a little bit more later. Okay, now I need my squeegee to clean off the deck there, and we've got a pretty good start. For now, I'd rather have this epoxy a little bit too liquid than too solid, because it's sinking down, but it's going down onto those straps, and making them even stronger. You want these straps to be quite strong if you're going to use them to tie the boat onto the car. Obviously they don't have to be strong for carrying the boat because the boat doesn't weigh much. But for tying onto the car, it's good to have them be strong. Okay, that's filling up nicely. We'll come back. It's going to sink down a little bit more. We'll come back and fill it a little bit more. We really want to get this mixture so it's not going to sag. I don't know. Here, can you see this? Yeah, there we are. So we're going a little bit thicker. That was just like about 1/3 of a spoon of silica added in. It's quite a delicate thing, getting just the right amount. Now let's look. Now, is that going to sag? Here, let's get it. We can see it. That's a pretty big blob. Is it sagging? That looks pretty solid. Looks like if I just held that for half an hour, it would set up just the way it is. That's what we want. We don't want this fillet to sag, but we still want it creamy and smooth. Okay. So we'll start placing it in right in the corner between the coaming and the deck. The more neatly you can place it, the less work you'll have getting it clean. Okay. Goal here is not to get air underneath the silica. You don't want to trap air underneath it. Okay. Nice clean spoon. Let's do our fillet here. Okay, now that looks really good. A couple of the tricks are use enough pressure that you have clean edges, that you haven't left a thick accumulation. That's, there's very little epoxy right there because I was pushing hard on the spoon. Okay, and then let's clean that off with the brush, and then we'll mix up some more. There we go. And we can use this right away, actually. We don't want it to set up at all before using it because it's hard to use once it's starting to set up. Let's try the squeegee on that excess there too. Good. Okay. So that's all there is to it. Keep going on along. You can see we got fairly far back, and now we have to continue the filleting with the spoon where it's messy there. And looking great. Okay. We'll get this done, and don't mix up more than 4 at a time because you want it to be very workable. Okay, and keep checking. I see a few places where I have too much epoxy on the deck. I'll get that off. Okay, keep checking, make sure it looks good. Okay, this morning we're going to just do a real quick job and take off these little overlaps here. We'll be cutting, this is the side of the coaming, the back of the seat, and the back deck here, side deck. We'll be cutting these overlaps off the back edge of the coaming, so the back 2 overlaps, which stick out farther than the front edge, front side, will be trimmed off right level with the edge of the back edge of the front piece. so it looks a little cleaner. This looks kind of staggered, and we'll just cut it off so it looks cleaner. But we have a fillet back here behind this piece, joining the coaming, the inside piece of the coaming to the back of the seat. We want that fillet to remain intact, so we're going to angle this cut at the same, a little sharper angle than the seat, or about the same angle as the seat back. Instead of cutting straight in, if we cut straight in, perpendicular to the coaming, we would be taking away most of our fillet. We want that fillet for strength, okay? So angle the cut a little bit. I'll be using a Dremel cutoff wheel on an extension, Dremel extension. The extension's nice because it's smaller diameter than the body of the tool and slightly lighter and easier to maneuver. But you could use a Dremel cutoff wheel just on the Dremel tool, but also a fine-tooth hacksaw blade will work quite nicely, just sawing down along that line as well. Okay, and this is, if you're using the Dremel wheel, this is silica dust that you're cutting into, so that you'll be putting up in the air. So it's good to wear a mask, a dust mask. So I'll get my dust mask on, and here we go. Safety glasses, of course, and I've got hearing protectors on too. Okay, good. Now we'll want to clean up the back edge. It's going to be blackened from the burning. You can see how black that is. We'll want to clean that. Oopsie. You can see how black that back edge is from the burning of the cutting. One advantage of using hacksaw instead would be if you didn't have any burning there. You wouldn't have any burning, so it would be a little less sanding. But the sanding goes quick. So we'll just sand out the black and smooth up that edge pretty quick. So you see that's coming out pretty nice. There, sands out pretty quickly. One reason for moving up and down the cut as you cut instead of cutting all the way through right at one point is you probably minimize the burning that way by you keep from getting one area too hot by moving down to cut into another area and then moving back and cutting through the first area. And we do have our fillet back behind that piece. See, there's an overlap. The coaming overlaps the back of the seat, so there is a fillet back in behind here. So that's going to add to the strength. And we'll clean up this front surface a little bit. Now remember, your varnish isn't going to hide anything. So clean things up to the extent that that's the final look. Your varnish will actually accentuate any differences that, if you forget to sand all the black out, or if you haven't sanded the epoxy off the surface here so it's smooth, your varnish is going to accentuate those differences, not cover them up. And you can see here, our cut here along this blends in, comes right down to join the deck, back edge of the deck here. So that's that's a straight cut across there, so we can sand right across those two surfaces, and it looks very coherent, like it was intended that way, which is what we want, because of course it was. Now, last night, look at these fillets, how nice they look now along the deck edge. Let's zoom out just a little bit here so you can see those fillets. See how nice the fillet along the between the cockpit coaming and the deck looks? You're not going to get a fillet as smooth as that just by spreading it ever. That was done with a fair amount of sanding last night, although it went fairly quickly. I was using 150 and then 180 and then 220 on it, and I actually sanded it while it was still a little bit green. It was definitely not sticky. You can't sand anything sticky, and it was strong. It just wasn't quite as hard as, you know, it gets as hard as glass. It's you know, as hard as cement or something when it's set up totally. Last night when I was sanding it, you could have still dug a fingernail into it. It's slightly rubbery consistency. If it's too rubbery, it's just not going to sand. It's just going to kind of rub and mush. But if it's just right, it'll sand a lot faster and easier than when it's set up completely hard. So don't try to sand it too early, but if you can catch it right at the right stage, it'll be faster than sanding it once it's super hard like this. Okay, that was, in my temperature, that was about 4 hours after I put the fillet in. In a warmer temperature, it might be 3 hours later. In colder, it might be 5 or 6 hours later. Okay, so quite temperature dependent on how soon you can sand it. Okay, looking nice. Get everything all cleaned up. And remember, in sanding that fillet, sand with the grain always. Okay, and then I also sanded this fill along the deck edge between the deck and the carbon fiber tube, and so we'll be sanding that a little bit more, and then we'll probably move next step to fitting our carbon fiber tubes. But let's sand the bow deck, get that to a nice matte finish and even, because the epoxy never goes on super smoothly. Also, the wood still has little filaments sticking up, so the epoxy will have coated those. So up here on the bow deck, we'll be sanding all of that area, sanding the coaming. Probably start with 180 and then move to 220. Okay, so that'll give us a good project for this morning. Oh, one more thing I did want to point out. Here at the back corner of the coaming, see how this comes to a point here? That looks a little, you know, a little awkward having that point there, but don't sand that point into a round, because remember, we're going to put the hardwood edging cap rail onto that piece of coaming, and that'll be glued on. We want it to glue on all the way to the tip of the back edge of the coaming right here, and then we'll round the hardwood edging into a nice gradual curve that bears down into that angle. So don't sand that tip to a point. It looks awkward and kind of jagged right now, but leave that as a point, because later on we'll be sanding the cap rail down. Okay, perfect. And we've started sanding out. Look how nice that fillet came out with the sanding. You can't get a fillet to lay perfectly like that just by spreading it nicely. You need to have enough there to sand it down, and it needs to be fairly even, but it's going to be sanding. And the same with the edge between the carbon fiber and the deck. That's coming out nicely with the sanding too. You can see back here it's been sanded fair all in along here, and that's going to fare in really nicely with the deck. Okay. Okay, we're getting this nicely sanded now, and it's hard to overemphasize the importance of sanding. One thing to remember is use sharp sandpaper. It makes it go faster, and sandpaper gets dull kind of gradually, and so you don't sometimes realize that the paper has gotten so dull. and it's time to use new paper. Okay, now I want to show you the deck's looking pretty clean. A little sanding dust on it still, but nicely sanded. And the deck is sanded very quickly and easily. These big surfaces of deck have sanded very quickly and easily because we were so careful to squeegee out any excess epoxy. So it's just a very thin coating, and that sands out very easily. If you get you know, a buildup and runs and sags or anything, you're going to be sanding a lot longer, and it's harder to get a good finish. Okay, and then along the what I want to show you is along the deck edge. It's going to be a little hard to see, but I want to show you here where it hasn't been sanded. You can see the light, you know, it's a little irregular there. That shows, you know, some bumpiness there. That'll all stand out with the varnish. The varnish just accentuates all of that. So that has not been sanded. Okay, now let's get up into the area that has been sanded. Okay, and you can see how smooth all this is along here where it's been sanded with 180 grit. I didn't want to go coarser. It would have been faster with coarser, but I didn't want to go coarser than 180 grit because I didn't want to scratch and have to sand out scratches up in the deck surface area up in here, this area. So 180 is doing it, and then I'll go over it with 220 and smooth out the 180 scratches. But quite a difference. Here's the, again, the unsanded part, and you can see how the light reflects off of that in, you know, kind of an irregular way. So bumpy in here and irregular everywhere. So in sanding, what you're doing is getting rid of any of the dark shiny areas. When you first go over it, there'll be, the high points will become, you know, smoother in a matte finish, and then, but there'll still be some darker glossy areas, and you keep sanding till all those darker glossy areas are gone. And I'm sanding outside here. That's kind of nice because then the sanding dust just blows away. So going great. Sanded our fillet a little bit more. I've been sanding on the back, sanding this back fillet here, and that's getting smoother. You can see that, you know, quite a bit of sanding dust coming off. And do not use power sanding equipment on this because you'll sand through the veneer on the surface and get a discoloration if you get into power sanding. Also, you can't get into the you know, various shapes. Sometimes using a block, but a lot of this is just with sandpaper folded up. You can see folded in 4 here, and sanding just right with the edge of the paper, the folded edge, right in that groove, and until you get rid of the shiny, all the shiny darker areas. You can see that that's just a start. Still shiny dark areas in right where I was sanding there, and we'll keep going until those shiny dark areas are gone and it's all smooth and blended together. Okay, just a little, remember, varnish. This is where you get the good varnish finish at this point with the sanding. Not by heavy layers of varnish. Varnish doesn't cover up stuff. Okay, here we go, more sanding. Getting ready to seam the inside of the kayak. Never my favorite part of the job, but it's actually relatively easy. Especially with a setup like this. There are different ways you could have it lower and, you know, get up inside of it that way, but this way I'll be able to stand. It's hanging about shoulder high. I'll be able to stand, and I'll be able to reach my arm up inside to spread the fillets. So what we're going to be doing, and we have a light. I don't know if you can see the light in there. We have a light that's giving us some good visibility up in there. So what we'll be doing is seaming the side as far forward as we can reach with a fillet, and back all the way to the seat back, and then we'll be seaming the deck joint along the crest, and then the last thing we'll be doing is adding carbon fiber rod inside the deck, one right across here, right at the front edge of the cockpit, from the shear right to the center line, and then one more a little farther forward. We've cut those rods already, and that's the solid carbon fiber rod. It's going to come inside the boat, on the inside, not the outside, but it's going to come right to the front edge of the cockpit coaming, right like that. So you can measure on the inside. I think 10 7/8 is what we decided on this longer one. And then the shorter one is 8 inches exactly. And that'll go farther forwards, right up in this area, about in here. And again, goes from the shear straight towards the center line. Okay, then on the center line, we'll be doing a fillet on the inside. Everything's on the inside now. Fillet on the inside, and then fiberglass tape on top of the fillet across the center line here. And the fiberglass tape will reach as far forwards as we can get it in there smoothly. Okay, so let's take a look inside. So again, 10 and 7/8 inches, just under 11 inches on this one, and on the longer one, and 8 inches on the shorter one. Now we're going to move and see if we can get a view for you inside the boat. Okay, it's going to be hard for you to see very much up here, but what we're doing is coating the center line now as far forwards as we can reach. We use plenty of epoxy here because it will just settle right into the groove where we want it. We mixed up 4 clear. We have the bow of the boat slightly lower. Let's see where this runs. We really won't object to its running forwards farther than we can reach. That would be kind of nice. So we're dumping that. That may be easier than the fillet, and we'll be using fiberglass tape here too. So just spread it wide enough for the fiberglass tape, and we'll leave a fairly thick sort of coating in there. Reach as far forwards as that brush will reach. Okay, and then we'll coat the side everywhere as far forwards as it'll reach again, and we'll go all the way back to the seat rest, back seat rest. Yeah, a little close in here. But don't go wild with the epoxy on this edge, because it's going to, any excess epoxy is just going to run down across the deck on the inside, and it won't really add any strength or have any use. So a little bit moderate on the epoxy here. We'll be doing a thickened fillet along here though, and that'll give it lots of strength. And then the last place we want to do is right along with the clear, right along the inside edge of the cockpit coaming. We're going to do a fillet between the cockpit coaming and the deck, right along the inside edge of the cockpit coaming. And then I'm going to do one more match, 4 large marks and 4 small marks, and we'll be back in a minute. Okay, now let's take a look at what we've got so far. And you may be wondering how big a fillet to do there. It's a little hard to see in there, but I can give you some guidelines. There, now we're seeing in there better. Slightly better light if I don't get in it. So from the front, I was able to reach, definitely not up to the very front carbon fiber ribbon on the hull, but up to the second one back. And I was able to, maybe you can see that up there, I was able to get about 2 or 3 inches in front of that second carbon fiber ribbon back from the front, from the bow, and brought the fillet back. And this was 4 large marks. I did 4 large marks just for this fillet on this side, so you could see how far back 4 large marks would bring it. You can see it's not a real big fillet. You don't want a real big fillet here. You don't need it. And the fillet, those 4 large marks came back just about an inch and a half past the front edge of the Kevlar. So that's about how big a fillet you should be doing. 4 large marks of resin with 4 small marks of hardener, and then the silica powder. Should bring you back, well, it's actually between the carbon fiber ribbons, 1, 2, 3 spaces between carbon fiber ribbons, plus a little bit at the beginning. About 3 inches at the front end. So don't do a huge fillet, and then clean it off nicely. I find it's easiest to clean off the excess after rubbing. You do your fillet with the spoon held fairly flat, not tipped up. You're not using the tip of the spoon, you're using sort of the flat bottom surface of the spoon. And then to clean off the excess from the edges of the fillet where it's pushed out to the side and not part of the fillet, I found it works best to use the spoon initially, and then scraping off the excess with the spoon, and then to go back over it with the brush, sort of picking up any of the last residue along the edges, so you can get a pretty clean fillet that way, even though it's somewhat awkward to reach up at the very front. Up in the very front, beyond where we have can reach for the fillet, we'll do a liquid epoxy fill up there, both on the center line and on the sides, where we'll just pour epoxy into tip the boat on its edge, pour the epoxy into it, into the edge, and where the fillet is, and then let it run down along that joint and seal up on the inside. And we'll do that on the center line too. But the loads are really back in the farther back part of the boat where the coaming is and the person is. So that bow section doesn't really get a lot of loading, so we're not too worried about it. And so we'll keep going with the pre-thicken. We'll finish up coming all along this edge back to the seat back, and then we'll do inside the coaming. Let's see if we can tip a little bit more there. Inside the coaming here, on the inside edge between the coaming, backside of the coaming and the deck, and then we'll get our fiberglass tape up along the center line there. I'm actually liking that that clear epoxy there. It's the way I've got the boat's that part of the deck is pretty level, and so we've got the epoxy sitting in a nice sort of trough there, quite even, and so we probably won't do pre-thickened up there, although you could do pre-thickened if you prefer. Okay, and then we'll get our carbon fiber tubes in after we get all the filleting done, and we'll have a take on this one. Okay, good. Okay, a quick recap of what we've done. We finished our fillets along the edges between the deck and the hull, and then we filleted, I don't know how well you can see this in here, probably not much, I can't really get an angle on it. Filleted along the inside of the cockpit coaming, fairly thin fillet. That was the entire length from the back seat on one side to the front, where the two sides of the cockpit coaming together, was just 5 large marks, and the same on the second side, 5 large marks. So don't try to fill that whole gap. You'd be adding unnecessary weight, and a lot of weight, and using a lot of epoxy. So it's just a pretty thin fillet right down along the bottom of that groove between the inside of the cockpit coaming and the deck. And then we went ahead and it's just easier to do at the same time, put in our carbon fiber rods to stiffen the deck up a little bit, just so it's not quite as flexible. Oh, and our fiberglass tape right there, running forwards 22 inches. We cut it 22 inches long, and that was about as far as I could reach up in there to the front. Now you're wondering what the can is doing here. Well, the deck had a bit of a bow inwards there, and so this back carbon fiber rod there wasn't laying exactly flat. Let's see if we can get more light on there. Wasn't laying exactly flat against the deck. So we just weighted the deck a little bit, and again, some creative clamping. Weighted the deck a little bit with that can. Just about anything would do it, a soup can or anything. Don't know if I'd use a book in there, but maybe. And to keep the can from sliding, we had to tape it to the deck, on the inside of the deck there, and that flattened the deck out just enough that the carbon fiber rod is laying pretty flat there now. And those carbon fiber rods are just to keep the deck from being quite as flexible. Not a lot of, you'd be okay without them, but it just stiffens up the deck in a nice way without adding hardly any weight. Now you can see on those carbon fiber rods, there's a fair amount of a fillet at the outer end, a glob of thickened epoxy. I coated underneath where those rods are positioned with clear epoxy and sanded quickly before clear coating, and then a blob of epoxy at the outer end where the rod sticks into the fillet at the along the edge, and then a blob in the middle and a blob at the inner end. And I left that space between the two ends of the rods where so when we dump the water out, the water will flow right out at right down the center line, flow out of the cockpit if we have the boat upside down and are dumping the water. And then further forwards, you can see the other two rods there, and they come together and meet at the center line. Again, I tried to make it fairly smooth, smooth right on the center line for water to flow out, and that looks good. One trick on these, on blobs of epoxy like this, here and here, is don't get your mixture too thick, first of all, because then you'll have little barbs coming off of it and sharp things that you don't want to catch your hand on. But one trick, and this is what I did here, was after you have all the thickened epoxy in place, holding those in place while it's still wet right away after putting the thickened epoxy on, mix up one large mark of clear epoxy and one small mark of hardener with it, and then just brush that over the top, and that'll smooth everything down really nicely, give you nice smooth rounded surfaces, so nothing sharp that your hand will catch on if you reach under there ever. Okay, so that covers it, and the last thing we're getting ready to do now is outside the boat, and that's nice to be outside. That's a relief. We're going to take the light off and we're going to clear coat this back surface of the seat where we haven't got any epoxy on there, and at the same time we'll clear coat these the back edges of the cockpit coaming, making sure we don't get any excess on the outside surface of the coaming there. So that'll be coated, and oh, we got our fillets in on the back deck underneath. That went really well. We mixed up 4 large marks, and that did both sides, port and starboard, and was just right. I think we mixed up 4 large marks. Well, before we added any silica, we brushed it on clear to coat it, and then we added silica to what was left, and that was still just the right amount of epoxy for that job. Okay, so the key is don't overuse the epoxy. It's heavy stuff, it's super strong. You don't need very much. Any excess, clean it off and reuse it. Okay. Oh, and then when we're talking about fillets, when we tell you how far a fillet goes with like 4 marks, when we were doing the fillets up there between the side deck, between the deck and the sides of the boat, and we said 4 marks would reach a certain distance, that's using all the spreading the fillet and then cleaning off the edges of the fillet and reusing that extra material to go farther. You can go the initial, before you clean off and use the extra material, you probably only get half as far as what we were talking about, or maybe just a little bit over half as far. And then when you clean off the excess material and use that to extend the fillet further, that's when you get the full length that we were talking about. Okay, looking pretty cool up there, and still quite neat. I mean, use your brush and your spoon to clean off excess epoxy. You can see these fillets aren't perfect. Nobody's going to see that up underneath behind the back deck, but still, it's nice to know that it's really quite clean and neat. Okay, good. Okay, tonight we are ironing wood. The pieces on the coaming that are the cap rails on the coaming that fit right on top of the laminated coaming pieces have quite a bit of bend towards the back. You can see right there in the center of the picture how much bend there is. That's a little bit more bend than the wood really wants to take without a little bit of coaxing and convincing. Possibly you could get that kind of bend just clamping it in place, but you might end up splitting the wood or not getting it tight to the coaming. So in preparation, what we've done is very simple, and it's a variation on steaming the wood, but a very simple variation. It's a small diameter, just under 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch, And so what we've done is just take a standard steam iron and fill it with water. And we've been fairly sloppy, spilling a lot of water on the corrugated on purpose, because we want to have as much water underneath the piece of wood and saturate the bottom as well as the top. And then I'm not going to do it tonight because I did it last night and got the curve in it, and I want to glue it tonight, so I don't want to get wet. So I'm not going to use water, but get a lot of water on the corrugated, get a lot of water on the piece, turn your steam iron all the way to high, and just iron back and forth. You can start bending it as you iron for about 4 or 5 minutes using the steam function. And don't sit in one place, you might burn the wood. Keep moving back and forth over about an 8 or 10 inch area. And after about 4 or 5 minutes, take the piece very quickly. You have to be right beside your boat because it cools off instantly. So you want to be even closer than this. Take the piece very quickly and bend it down into position. You can hold it in position, but you're going to want a clamp on there. So if you have one of these big squeeze clamps, it's great. You know, once you buy one of these, you'll find that you have all sorts of uses for it. And you can get it right on like that, let it sit overnight, and the next morning you'll have the bend pretty much what you want. Although what I'm finding is there's more bend right where the clamp is. So when I glue these on, I'm actually going to skid it back a little bit so I don't have it lifting off right behind the clamp. So, it's a little hard to clamp right where it's slanted so much. So when I glue this on, I have a little excess at the front. I'm going to slide it back a little bit, making sure I have enough wood at the front. And then the most significant amount of the curve will be right where we want it, right in here. Okay, and you can see this first side looks really nice over here. That's just taped in place, no glue yet, but tonight we'll be gluing it in place. And first thing is to shape the bevel the bow, the front corners of those pieces. A little hard to see with the light there. Bevel the front corners, front of the pieces where the two pieces come together. And so that's what we'll be starting on. Okay, any kind of cutting tool with fine teeth will work on beveling these pieces. I'm going to use the Dremel because it's fast and easy, but a fine-toothed hacksaw will work fine. Once you get the two pieces close to the right angle, then just holding the piece and rubbing it on a piece of sandpaper works fine. Just a warning though, don't bevel the wrong side. Don't bevel the top or the bottom by mistake. You have to, you know, definitely want to mark it with a pencil before you start to do any work beveling it. Doesn't have, well, it may as well be a fairly accurate mark actually, and then you can cut right to your mark with pencil. Okay, so I'll be working on that, and then we'll get this glued on and clamped, and then if we have time we'll move ahead and do the very thin strips of mahogany that go along the crest of the deck. Right where the two halves of the deck join. So that'd be great to get all those steps done. We'll see how how quickly this first step goes. After that, we're ready to just a little bit more sanding, a little shaping. Well, after this coaming cap rail is glued in place and set up, then we'll round it so it's a nice smooth round edge. But that'll be easier to do once it's in place because the square edge lets us clamp it more easily and control it better. Okay, so get set, ready to bevel. Hacksaw, or real fine hacksaw blade, or hobby saw, or a Dremel. Mark it first. Leave yourself a little excess if you haven't got your angle exactly right, so so you can sand it back and get it perfect. Okay, because that's a very visible place, and it's easy to get essentially perfect by just cutting it first a little bit long and then sanding it to the perfect shape. Okay, we'll be back soon. Bye. Okay, now we've taped off the cockpit coaming right up almost to the edge, about a 32nd of an inch below the edge, so our tape won't get captured by the epoxy, won't get encapsulated by the epoxy. So a 32nd inch below the edge of the top edge of the coaming, and on both sides, inside and outside, on both sides, port and starboard. So now we mixed up one large mark of resin with one small mark of hardener, and we're just brushing that on the edge. You know, a moderate coating, not super thick. We don't want it to run down the sides, but you know, as thick as we can get it on there without it running at all. And so we'll coat both sides, the edge of the coaming this way with clear, and then make sure you keep track of which side is which on the cap rail, and then we'll coat the bottom side of the cap rail as well. So now we'll take this, and all we want to coat is the bottom side of this one, so make sure you've got it turned the right way, and just brush that on. I think the back end sticks out quite a bit, so we'll just let it stick out. Well, I'll coat right to the end just in case, but I think it sticks out about 1.5 inches. Okay, now this looks like it's going to soak up a little bit more resin, so I'll put a slightly heavier coat on here. But I think that one large mark probably should get me both sides of the boat, and both of the cap rails coated on the bottom side. And then we'll mix another batch with a little bit of silica in it. Doesn't have to be a totally non-sag, because in a small tight joint like this, we're not talking about large blobs of epoxy that are going to sag like in a fillet, especially an upside down fillet. So so we don't need a lot of silica in the mixture, but we will have some silica in it. And then we'll want to coat things with the silica mixture. We'll put that on the boat itself, on the top edge of the coaming. We want that coating to be thick enough that it squeezes out a little bit everywhere, but not very much. This is a somewhat more of a decorative piece than a structural piece. We just don't want it to fall off ever, so so we don't need to be quite as astute about our gluing technique as when it's a structural joint. Okay, so we'll finish coating this, and then we'll mix up, and then we'll coat the other side, then we'll mix up one large mark of clear, a second large mark of clear, and coat the end grain especially well up the front where the bevel is, because the end grain is going to absorb a lot more resin. So we'll mix up, after we coat both sides with the clear, we'll mix up another large mark of resin, small mark of hardener, and that time we'll add silica to it. Okay, that's that side. I think you got the picture there pretty well. Okay, now we've mixed up a really runny batch of silica. That's what we want, just like that. We don't want a thick batch. And watch how we spread it. We just put a very light, putting a very light coating on. It's probably twice as thick as the clear coating, but still only at most, well, less than a 32nd of an inch thick. I mean, it's very thin. And still we're going to have it squeezing out all over the place. So you'll catch any drips. Here's a drip. Oh, one thing that is important that will make all of this go much more smoothly and faster and easier is before you tape or anything. Actually, I did it after I taped because I forgot. But before you tape, sand the top edge of your coaming square. I'd already sanded it a little bit, and then I sanded it a little bit more after I taped. But you want that top edge to be as square as possible, perpendicular to the side of the coaming. And that gives you a nice surface to glue to, as your coaming's not going to be sort of wobbly and tipping while it's while you're trying to get it in position. So a nice square surface. Okay, that's pretty good. I wonder if you can see how much is on there. It's pretty light. Pretty light coating on there. We can try to zoom in a little bit and see if that reveals more. No, it's really not going to show very well in this low light. Doesn't like to zoom in there. That shows it a little bit. It's very thin. Okay, in fact, it's not quite even. You can see it's a little bit thicker there than it is right here, but that's good enough. It'll all work fine. Okay, now let's zoom out. We're going to get that coaming in place and get it clamped and taped in place. We'll use any system you want, but we're going to use clamps and tape. And we're going to start at the front with both pieces, because that's the only way we'll get a really good joint. We've got both sides coated with the slightly thickened silica mixture, just on the boat, not on the coaming. We don't want that much. If we put it on the coaming too, we'd have way excess and be squeezing out and making a mess everywhere. Okay, and this first part's going to be kind of awkward, and we'll probably have to adjust it a couple of times, but we'll try to get it positioned fairly accurately this first time and see how we do. And a piece of tape up here near the front. Get that coaming down square on the, you get the cap rail down square on the coaming. Don't have it at a funny angle. And then our second piece here. Now this is where we'll probably end up doing several attempts to get this right. One thing that I forgot to do, which is a good idea, is to give yourself some pieces of tape to start with. I like the 1-inch tape for this because I don't want to have too much, and use about 6-inch pieces, 5 or 6-inch pieces, so you have a lot of holding power. So it's always good to tear off several pieces of tape. It's hard to tear the tape while you're holding things in place, unless you have a willing assistant. Okay, now our second piece. You can see how we're doing here at the bow. Gloves are definitely a good idea in this operation, even though gloves and tape are always a nuisance. To try to handle tape with gloves on is always awkward, but you're going to get your fingers awfully sticky if you don't have gloves. Okay, so that's down tight, and our joint looks really nice at the front. Okay, so we hit it right on. If it's not right at the front, then take off that first piece and get it right. You should. This is a pretty small gluing job. You should have enough time to futz around with it a little bit. Don't. If it's warm, don't do it. Don't waste too much time. Okay, and then working back on the starboard side, make sure each one of these tapes is down totally tight, because you don't want to have the tape holding your piece. This is apart, holding the cap rail off the coaming. So make sure your tape is pulling down tight on the piece. And you can see we're going to have some squeezing out, but not very much, which is really what we want. We don't want a whole lot of extra resin squeezing out. Okay, this is just the first step here, the tape. Then we'll come back with some paper clamps and get our alignment sideways just right, because at this point the alignment sideways is not very precise. the cap rail is not necessarily sitting exactly centered on top of that, on top of the coaming. Okay, pulling down tight on these tapes. See if you can see the rest of it. Now we're back far enough I can get the clamp on the curved part here. If you have a squeezed clamp, you could probably manage to get a C-clamp, a small light C-clamp, to stay in position here. But these squeeze clamps are awfully easy to use. So if you have access to a squeeze clamp, that's probably your best bet. Okay, these are about 9-inch long squeeze clamps, 8 or 9 inches long. And you'll find it's, if you don't have them now, I didn't used to have them, and then I had one job that it was like, oh, that would be perfect. And so I got about 5 or 6 of them, and now I use them all the time for all sorts of stuff. They're very handy just for holding stuff in place, and or clamping stuff if it's light enough that you don't need a lot of clamping pressure. Of course, squeeze clamp won't give the clamping pressure the C-clamp will give, but for something like this, it's plenty of pressure. Okay, and another tape in here to make sure we're down tight. Stick the tape on really tight and then pull it tight as you go over the top and stick it down tight. Bit of a technique there. Now I've probably got a teensy little gap here, so I'm going to see if my tape will pull that in. Now I'm going to use a slightly different technique here. I'm going to hold down both sides, pull down really tight, as tight as I can without breaking the tape, and then stick it on, and we'll see if that gap is gone. There, it was just a very small gap, almost filled with epoxy, but yeah, that took care of it. Okay, so now we're tight down everywhere, and looking very good. Oh, a little gap right here, so let's take care of that. And everywhere else looks tight, but not necessarily lined up yet. So we're just trying to get the gap tight first. And again, we'll do the technique with hand on each side, pulling down tight. And I can see resin squeezing out, so that should mean we've got our gap tight now. Gap closed. Yes, that looks good. Now, if you're getting fingerprints on your boat, during this process, wipe them off right away. No point in having to come back and sand them later. They wipe off easily. Okay, so that looks good. Let's get the other side that far along, and then we'll come back and, well, I can show you on this side. What we're going to be doing, let's get this side finished, and then we'll do the same thing on the other side. We're going to take the paper clamps now, these little simple to use things, and any place we need to, we're going to use them to line up the coaming. The cap rail and the coaming. The cap rail typically is just a teensy bit wider than the coaming, with the idea that then we'll sand down the cap rail. So if you've got a little bit excess on both sides, that's pretty much ideal. Okay, so just use those paper clamps. I need one at the bow, definitely here, as close to the very front as possible in this case. Okay, and that brought it right in. Okay. Good. You can use your fingers to feel how the alignment is. It's all pretty good along here. I'll check the inside too. It's all pretty good along here. We've got just the right amount of epoxy squeezing out, not enough to run down anywhere. Now here I'm going to put one. No, that pushing it sideways. Yeah, that lined it up just by pushing it sideways, and it stayed in place. Okay. So checking the alignment on both sides. Again, I pushed that one sideways a little bit and it stayed. Checking the alignment on both sides. Make sure we're pretty even on both sides. Okay, very nice. That side's done. Don't need paper clamps anywhere in here. Just have 3 up at the front there. Let's get, and the squeeze clamp at the back. Okay, now we're getting ready for the center strips, and we're just we mixed up 1 mark of clear and 1 large mark of clear, 1 small mark of hardener, and we've taped off the edge, so along the edge of the veneer strips, just the right width, just a little bit extra width, but not much. And now we're getting ready to spread the epoxy. We're just doing it right in place here. That's working out quite nicely. So this is just the clear now, and then we'll also do a batch of pre-thickened as well, and that'll give us a little excess, and it'll be squeezing out a bit, but better that than having a dry spot or a void underneath someplace, because if you have a void underneath this veneer, it's going to buckle up, and that's a little bit difficult to fix. Not impossible, but it's nice to get it down solidly and not have any voids underneath. So you want to coat the back side of the veneer and the top of the deck in that narrow, just over 1/4 of an inch gap that we've left there at the crest of the deck. Okay, and we are closing the gap, so to speak, as far as being almost finished with all of our epoxy work and ready to move on to varnishing, which is awfully fun. So back deck goes quickly. It's laying the mylar skin over the back deck is quite a fast process and fun, and so we are getting close. Okay, so I'm just going to spread this, then I'll mix up 1 large mark with pre-thickened with a little silica and hardener, of course, and we'll spread that on about the same thickness as we did for the coaming, and then we'll come back and show you how we're doing the pins. Okay, and now the last phase. The goal here being to keep the veneers centered right along the crest line, so you don't have any wandering. You don't want them to wander back and forth. And pins about every inch, 1 pin on each side. The second side, grab the pin so it's just sticking out a little less than 1/4 of an inch from the tip of the pliers, and as you grab that second side, pull it up tight against the first side, and then poke the pin in. The pin doesn't have to be in very far, but you definitely want to have some clamping pressure there so you don't have bumps and bumps up and down. And if you don't want to have used too much resin underneath here either, else you'll have ridges between the pins. And this is a thin veneer. You really can't sand a thin veneer like this hardly at all without sanding through. So so we're going to try to clean off as much resin as possible and almost eliminate the sanding, because we don't want to sand through the veneer in different places. That would defeat the decorative purposes of the veneer. Okay, and I'm using my tape line to make sure that my veneer is straight. So if my tape was straight and my veneer is straight relative to the veneer, to the tape, then I should be in good shape. If your tape line was crooked or wavering, then that's not such a good guide anymore. I'd like to clean it off and make sure that those two pieces are meeting nicely in the middle and not overlapping each other, bumping one up high. Now that looks really good. We'll be cleaning off all this excess epoxy because it comes off easily now. It sure doesn't come off as easily once it sets up. So quite a bit of cleaning up after the pins are all in. We'll be cleaning up between the pins and around the pins as much as possible, because we want to really reduce the sanding required on this piece. A lot of light is good. Hard to see things without light. If you do a job with poor light and then come back and look at it with good light, you'll be surprised. Make sure you don't have tape underneath your veneer anywhere. That would be a mess. No solution to that problem. No good solution or easy solution. Okay, so I think that's that should do it. Keep your light right where you need it. Movable light is probably the best in this case. Okay, and then we'll be getting the back deck on, and we're getting so close. I can't wait to paddle. Back deck, you can see exactly how that's done in the previous video, part 7 of 7, in the earlier sequence of building videos for the kayak. So we may not really get into that. It's exactly the same on this boat, and that was very well covered before. In fact, this front veneer is probably well covered too. So some repetition here, but primarily we've been trying to cover the parts of the build that were different from the first build, especially the deck. The deck coming back farther and, you know, being sitting on top of the side of the back of the seat. Okay, and our coaming's looking good. That's all setting up as we talk. Clamps everywhere. Oh, I did want to show you on the second side. Who knows why, but I needed a lot more clamps on the second side. Now I have 3 of the big squeeze clamps, a couple of small squeeze clamps centering the cap rail. Mostly I was just using the tape and the paper clamps, but I do have more paper clamps as well. Why was one side needing more persuasion than the other? Who knows. Anyway, use as many clamps as you need to make it sit right where you want it. Okay, looks good. See you later. Be paddling soon. Can't wait. Clear goal. This is not needlepoint or something where you just admire it. Clear goal. Let's get out paddling. Okay, good morning. Now we're outside. Out of the low basement with that beam that I had to duck to avoid. Here I want to show you the pins. I counted 96 pins, so about almost 100 pins, but they go in quickly and easily. They don't have to be in very far, just enough to hold the veneer. In fact, you don't want to push them down very far, just enough to hold the veneer down. And the veneer looks very straight. Looking down the center line, the veneer looks great. No dramatic wavers or wobbles in it, so that's terrific. Now what I really wanted to show you though was back here on the clamping. This is a pretty neat trick. I've taken off a lot of the most of the clamps, except for these few at the front where I wanted to show you this trick. So these two are just lining up the cap rail with the coaming, so the cap rail isn't off center to one side or the other. And if you use the right amount of epoxy, all these clamps will come off pretty easily. If you used really, a great deal more epoxy than necessary, your clamps may be stuck on there a little bit tighter. Okay, but this is what I wanted to show you. Now, it's hard to clamp on the two pieces together where they come together at the front, because clamps will just tend to skid right off. It's enough of an angle that they just want to pop off. So what we do is we use a little bit of foam insulation, adhesive-backed foam insulation, and that makes the clamps less likely to skid off. And so you can see here the foam insulation is inside, stuck to the clamp. The adhesive side is stuck to the clamp, and then the squishy side is against the boat. Okay, now let's see how we did. And the tape might be enough by itself, but it doesn't hurt to double up with the clamp as well on top of the tape. Okay, let's see how that joint turned out. And that's looking really nice so far. We can get our tape off. Here we go. Okay, that's going to sand out really nicely. See, we have the angle just right on that, and a little bit of epoxy on top, but that'll sand out really quickly and easily. And then at the back edge of the coaming, we'll be cutting this off at the same angle as the side of the coaming coming up there. Tape out of your way. The side of the coaming comes up, we'll cut this cap rail off at the same angle, continuing that angle up, and then instead of having a real sharp point there, we'll be rounding the back edge of the cap rail to a nice round, so it looks very gracious and elegant. Okay, so and then we'll be sanding the cap rail, the edge of the cap rail, to a nice curve. We'll probably start with 100 grit on that, and then move to 150 and 180 and 220. And we are wrapping up the last details here, but we still do need inside the boat to coat up at the front of the boat between the deck and the sides of the boat, and also along the center line where we couldn't reach with our arm. And so we'll get probably use a longer stick with the paintbrush, maybe even the yardstick, with the paintbrush taped to the end of the stick. So we can reach way up in there and get those surfaces coated. But looking really, really clean and really nice, and excited about getting to the varnishing. We'll pull the pins out as well. Remember, on the pins, you want to grab them with the needle nose pliers and twist the pin. Rotate it before you pull it out. The rotating breaks the seal with the epoxy, and then they'll come out easily and not damage the wood. Okay, so stay tuned. We're almost ready to paddle. Now we've moved to the upper deck where we have a lovely view of the Puget Sound, where we'll soon be paddling. And just wanted to make another point here. In sanding down the rub rail, it's going to be best if you leave your blue tape along the edge. Pull off the ones that go over the top, but leave your blue tape that goes along the edge, because that'll protect the surface of the plywood. And we have a fairly nice coating on that of epoxy and nicely sanded, so we don't want to rough that up with our 100 grit as we sand down the cap rail. Okay, and same on the inside. Leave that line of tape on the inside, and that also helps with pulling the tape off later on, because we will have sanded through any of the epoxy that might have encapsulated the tape or captured the tape under it. Okay, looking really good. We do have the back edges of the cap rail starting to be shaped, cut off flush with the back edge of the coaming here, and starting to be shaped to a nice gentle curve there, and looking just great. All the pins are out. They came out easily. On the pins on this veneer up here, we won't use 100 grit on that. Might go 150 on that, but be very careful. It's very thin veneer here. Be very careful not to sand through. Just barely get the surface smooth and then stop. And you can see along this edge we have a nice clean edge along here. We used a small piece of the veneer as a sort of a chisel to slide along that edge to clean it off, clean out any of the excess epoxy inside that edge after cleaning everything off with the brush. And you can see we got the surface. It's not smooth enough yet for varnishing, of course, but we got it fairly smooth by brushing assiduously excess epoxy off between the pins and around the pins, and along the center line and along the edges. So so it's all looking very clean and very neat. Minimum of sanding required, and very encouraging. This joint at the bow is cleaning up very nicely. Very pleased with the way that turned out. And oh, I did want to show right in here, we added a little, right at the end, we added a little epoxy so those ends of the veneer are somewhat encapsulated. At least they're not standing up proud above the surface. So that was just a little of the excess we cleaned off. We added in here at the ends. Okay, looking very, very clean. Very nice. And another view out over the water. Paddling soon. There's a sailboat way out there on the Sound. There we go. Okay, now we have the hull almost sanded down, but I left a little bit so you could see what's involved here. If you just left the silver tip epoxy, you'd have a fairly nice finish if you got it smooth, but not as fast or smooth as if you sand it down and varnish it. So we're using a 180 grit sandpaper to start with. We don't really want to go coarser because then we'll have coarser scratches that we'll have to sand out. The 180 is doing a real nice job, and so here's the part that I haven't sanded yet here, and if I feel it, I can feel irregularities and some bumps, and I don't know if you can get the reflection right. You might be able to see some of that. You'll be able to see some more of it. If you get down a little bit lower, you might be able to see some of that more. Let's see what the camera angle does as far as seeing irregularities. It's a little hard to see. Let's zoom in maybe. You can see it's not a perfectly smooth surface. It's pretty nice, but not perfect. So to get it perfect, we'll do this 180 grit, and then we'll go over it with 220 grit. Now here's a sag right here. You can see that because, see if you can see that at least, because now we're sanding the high points. Yeah, there you can see it. We're sanding the high points, and that leaves the low points, of course. So we'll sand that until there are no more high points. The trick, though, is see the lighter white areas are high points. Little sags, kind of runs and sags. You're going to get that with epoxy, no matter how good you are. If it's not a perfectly horizontal surface, which this obviously isn't, you're going to get some sags and runs like that. Okay, so I'll sand those out until we have a surface that looks totally uniform. Once we get the uniform surface where it's all the same sort of matte finish, sort of more like up in here. See? Up in here, that's totally uniform. There are no sags, no runs, no shiny spots. No shiny spots. It's all that sort of matte finish. Maybe maybe very small shiny spots, but very, very small. I don't know if you could even see where I was pointing there. Very small. You can't really see them. They're very small. So that's what you're looking for. A really uniform finish surface, and that'll varnish beautifully. So we'll sand this out up here with the 180, and when we have a uniform surface, then we'll switch to the 220 to take out the scratch marks from the 180 grit sandpaper. Now that's getting better, but there's still, you can feel it with your fingers. You can feel things that you can't see, irregularities that you can't see. So down here feels totally smooth. Up here I feel some ridges still. So keep going until you can't see or feel any irregularities at all with 180, and then hit it with 220. What we're trying to avoid, we're trying to get it perfectly smooth, but we don't want to sand through the fiberglass cloth. It's pretty thin fiberglass cloth that you put on here, and you don't want to sand into that or through it. So So just stop as soon as you have a smooth surface. And that should not get into the fiberglass cloth. Would be the idea. Still a little bit of shiny unsanded stuff right in here, and we'll get that out. It's nice to do this process either outside or with a dust mask, because you don't want to breathe the sanding dust from the epoxy, but especially you don't want to breathe any sanding dust from the fiberglass cloth if you're getting into the fiberglass cloth. Although the goal here is not to sand into the fiberglass cloth, just to sand the epoxy that is over the top of the fiberglass cloth. Okay, so the 180 is doing a nice job on here. Keep going until all the shiny spots, the darker shiny spots are gone. We don't want to do more than necessary because we do not want to sand into the fiberglass cloth. This thin fiberglass cloth, you cut through it pretty quick. And that's why we're using 180. It's a little bit more work than if we had a coarser grit. But with a coarser grit, we'd be more likely to cut into the fiberglass cloth and mess it up. Dust mask is good when we get this sanded smooth with the 180. And oh, another point, on some of these curved surfaces, you want to use smaller pieces by hand, because the block's not going to conform to the curve, obviously. And then once you get the surface pretty smooth with the 180, then go over it with the 220 and make sure you get all the scratch marks from the 180 out. And keep working on any places that still have a shiny surface to them. Those are slight depressions where you haven't sanded yet. So it goes pretty quick, epoxy stuff, but with good sandpaper, keep using, don't use old tired sandpaper, keep using fresh sandpaper when your sandpaper gets dull. And then when we have a perfect finish with a smooth matte surface like we have down in these areas, then we'll be ready to varnish. The key to varnishing is to have a perfect surface to start with. If you don't have a really good surface to start with, your varnishing will not turn out well. And then we'll use high quality varnish with ultraviolet sunblock filters in it. I'll probably tend to use Captain's varnish, since we use that on a lot of products and have a lot of it. And that's a Z-Spar Captain's varnish. And then another Z-Spar product is Flagship varnish. It's a little bit, little pricier, not much different. And they promote that as having even more UV filters in it. So either Captain's varnish or Flagship will do really well. It is nice to have UV filters, and that's what you get with more expensive varnishes, because epoxy is not very UV stable, so it's nice to have a UV protective coating on top of the epoxy. Okay, I think that's all you need to know. Get ready to sand. The sanding does take a while to get it really good, but that will be the key to getting a good varnish coating. And if you decide just to leave it with the silver tip, couple of negatives. One is it won't be nearly as smooth as if you sand it down and varnish it. And second is you won't have any UV protection on it. But the silver tip does look pretty good, and is not a terrible choice. But I think the extra work of varnishing it is probably worthwhile. Okay, good. Back to sanding. Oh, dust mask. Dust mask is a good idea. You really don't want to be breathing dust all the time. Or work outside if there's a bit of breeze blowing the dust away from you. Good. Hey, one last comment on the sanding. Along the crest here, you really don't want to even hardly touch that with the 180 grit sandpaper. You'll sand right through instantly if you touch it with a sanding block on the top, right at the point of the V. So, and you want that's probably one of the more important places to have the fiberglass cloth intact, where those two bottom panels come together. You could brush it very lightly with 220 grit sandpaper just like this, but that's about all, very little pressure. That's about all I would do on the crest line. You can sand right up to it on the flat, but not over it. And you obviously won't have any runs or sags on that. It really doesn't need any sanding right along the very crest line except that very light brushing. So be careful there. There are lots of ways to do this. Tipping the boat up so we can finish coating between the deck and the sides of the boat, inside the boat, we'll show you in a minute, where we weren't able to reach the last time. We were coating along between the deck edge and the hull. So we've got the boat tied up here to railing, an air tube actually, overhead, and have it at just the right angle so the lowest point in the sheer edge between the deck and the hull is about 1.5 feet back from the bow. And now let's take a look inside at what we'll be working on, and so you can see where we're going with this. Okay, and of course things are a funny angle. This actually gives you a nice view of a lot of different things here. You can see the carbon fiber rods that we've attached to the underside of the deck. Those we don't use in the smaller boat because the deck is narrower and doesn't really need any additional stiffness. This deck would be fine without them probably, but I think the extra stiffness is nice, and you're adding very, very minimal amount of weight there. So the carbon fiber rods, the longer ones here are 10 7/8 inches, I think we said, and the further forward ones are 8 inches long. And you can see they have a fillet, just a sort of blob of epoxy at each end and a blob in the middle. And then one thing I did want to point out was here in the front, right in front of us, right at the front end of the coaming here, those two rods right there do not come together to touch each other. We want the water, if there's just a teensy dribble of water in the boat, it's kind of nice to be able to pour it out and have it run right along the center, tip the boat upside down, have the water run right along the center line and out the cockpit, and not have it, dammed up by something that keeps it from running out. So those further forward ones, they can touch because that won't stop the water from running out at the end. And now, what we're working on this morning is on the downside there. We have it tipped, so when we pour epoxy into that V between the deck and the hull, right along, maybe I can point to it, right along this line here, right there between the deck and the hull, that epoxy will form a bit of a, sort of a fillet. It's just liquid epoxy, but it'll fill in any gaps there and coat the wood and help to secure the deck to the hull. Although it's pretty well secured with what we did on the outside. This just gives an additional reinforcing. You can see we've already done that. Well, maybe you can't see, but we can zoom in, see if you can see it. We've already done that on the other side, which we'll be working on the port side now. We've already done that epoxy work along this edge while you weren't watching, weren't with us. So that's all filled in, and now we'll do it along this edge. You can see we have that edge of bare wood that we left on the deck. We'll want to coat that and then add enough epoxy there that it will fill. We'll be mixing 6 large marks of epoxy with clear epoxy with 6 small marks of hardener. And you can see we still haven't done the center line up there where we couldn't reach, and so we'll get to that as a separate step. But we have to we can't do those two together because we have to keep the boat until the epoxy is set up enough along the edge in that groove. We have to keep the boat positioned like this so the epoxy will stay in the groove and not go running across the hull or across the deck. Okay, so that's where we're at right now. You see that nice fillet we have at the very bow, and you can see beside the fillet the black straps from the nylon webbing grab loop. So that kind of orients you there. And along here you can see the fiberglass tape that we've put, if it'll focus, well, even with minimal focusing there, you can see the fiberglass tape. There it is. Fiberglass tape that we've put along the crest of the deck on the underneath side. Up in the front there, we can use fiberglass tape along there too if we want to, or we can just use epoxy. Either way will be fine. Okay, so one more thing I'll show you is the very sophisticated tools that we're going to be using. And these are tools that are so sophisticated you won't be able to find them in any kind of store. Let's scroll over here and zoom back out. Okay, there's one of the tools. See how nice that is? What a very sophisticated concept that is. It's a yardstick, a 36-inch yardstick, with one of your epoxy brushes taped onto the end at an angle with electrical tape. So there's just a little block of wood right here underneath the paintbrush, underneath the brush, and then the electrical tape, and here the brush is touching so it puts it at an angle. If it's straight out, it's not going to work very well. So that brush taped on at a slight angle. Doesn't really make much difference what angle. Now the second piece of high-tech equipment we need is here. And this is quite a complex piece of equipment. Again, we have the 36-inch yardstick, and taped to the end we have our mixing pot. Actually, we can mix right in this pot, and we're going to be using this as a tool to reach way up to the front of the boat, and we'll be holding it way down here at about 3 inches. We need precision here. 3.25 inches. We'll be holding it at 3.25 inches, and we'll be reaching way in, and then we'll be dumping the epoxy into the bilge. If we dump it off that side, maybe a little better, but we can dump it off either side. Okay, into the that V space between, we'll be dumping the epoxy into the V space between the hull planking, where the hull planking meets the deck, and we'll be moving this along and just not dumping it so much as pouring it precisely so we have an even amount of epoxy the entire length of that space. The only problem with this is we won't be able to reach all the way to the very bow because the bow gets too narrow, and so that's where the brush comes in primarily, although we can also brush the bare wood on the bottom side of the deck to make sure that's all coated. But the brush can be used just to push the epoxy, urge it forwards up into the bow section, the last 4 or 5 inches forwards, where we can't be pouring it because the container we're pouring from won't fit up there. So that way we get an even amount of epoxy. The entire length, it's about a 2.5 foot length, I guess, or might even be 3 feet, but 2.5 feet or so. And so that is the equipment we need. See if you can fabricate something similar like this. Okay. Man's first tools when we emerged from a primitive state. Okay, sure you'll be able to do something that's even more sophisticated than these. Thank you. Okay, we'll mix up some epoxy and get to work. I'll show you a little bit more about this step, but it's pretty simple. Okay, here we go. 6 large marks, 6 small marks. I know you can see. I'm hoping I can see too. Thanks for your good light. Okay, and we'll just reach as far forwards as we can and start pouring. We're going to need some of that to push forwards. Okay, whoa, 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 hard to control. There we go. That's looking pretty good now. Pretty even pour. Okay, just get a little more up front where we're going to be pushing it forwards up into the bow. A little bit here we missed. Okay, we'll dump the rest up front. Maybe we're a little bit light right in here. And that's where our fillet joins, where our fillet ended there. Where we're going to reach to. Okay, now the brush, this isn't even a new brush actually. This brush is all hard with epoxy, but I actually think it'll work for what we're doing. Just shoving that stuff forwards, that extra pile that we put up there. Right up to the very bow, if you can get it up there. There, I think we got it. Good. That's it. All there is to it. Not too hard. Okay. Now, the big thing is don't think, oh, now I'll do the other side, or now I'll do the middle and roll the kayak, because all that epoxy you just put in would run across the deck or across the hull or out of the place where you want it. So now you have to make sure it sets up. You can keep checking your brush or your pot and make sure that it is totally set up before you race on to the next step, which for us is going to be coating right down the center line of the deck. And maybe we'll probably throw a piece of fiberglass tape on there too, just for extra precaution. Okay, see you soon. Okay, here we are. We've mixed up 6 large marks of resin with 6 small marks of hardener, and we've mixed it up in our mixing pot that's on our yardstick. And so it's right here. First step, and we've cut our fiberglass tape to 22 inches long, but we just measured that length inside the boat with our yardstick to see how much we needed to reach to the front from the fiberglass tape we already put in on the center line. We're working on the center line. And this is a big day because this is our last epoxy step in completing the boat. We still have the back deck to add on, but no epoxy involved there. So this is our last epoxy step. So big day. And so we're going to start by coating our fiberglass tape, thin coating, but totally saturated, but a thin coating with epoxy. And a little bit awkward, but we're going to use this brush that's still on the yardstick. And already we've got a good example of something to watch out for. We caught the end here, so we're going to clip that and get rid of this extra piece there, because if we kept going, we'd unravel the entire piece. It would just unravel all the way up the tape. And so coating here. This time we'll be careful not to catch the end to start to unravel it at the end. It's a little bit awkward doing it out of the pot, but we're going to make it work. Could use a separate brush here, and we did heat the resin in the pot slightly because we're working, it's about 45 degrees here today, this morning. It's a beautiful sunny day, but it's getting a little cooler. And so we heated the resin in the pot a little bit over a light bulb. And we have a heater in the background heating up the boat. I should make sure it's not getting too hot. Now that feels fine. Remember, you don't want to heat the boat after applying the resin, because when you heat wood, air in the cells of the wood expands and starts to come out and create bubbles in the coating. So you can heat it before you put any epoxy on, and then your epoxy is going to both spread a little bit easier and set off a little bit faster. And you can heat the epoxy in your pot, but don't heat the wood after you've applied the epoxy, because then you'll just get massive bubbling as air squirts out of the wood. Okay, I think you can see how this goes. And we will keep brushing until all the cloth has turned clear. We have no white parts left in the cloth. But we don't want to get, we want to keep this thin as possible, and so we'll keep brushing over it and make sure that we don't have any excess epoxy, but we do want to saturate it. And then then we'll be back inside the boat, and so we'll see you soon inside the boat. Okay, this worked well. We actually, at the end coating, we folded the fiberglass cloth back on top of itself to coat the last bit that was not coated yet. And then we just kind of used some of the excess resin on the piece below to coat the part at the end that had not been coated, just by tapping it down in that. And that worked very well. And now we'll be taking this part and hanging it. Okay, so we've got it hanging on the brush now, on the yardstick now. This is going to be a little awkward to get it positioned, but not really difficult. Just take a little fiddling. Okay, now we're moving inside the boat. Just a quick view of how we have the boat positioned. We again have one end hanging up high. This could be done on outside, on bushes, or off the edge of a porch, or in your workshop hanging to the ceiling. Lots of different ways to do it. We have the front end supported there on blocks with a towel underneath the bow, and we've got it so the boat is no longer tipped one side to the other. It's square upside down, and we have it so the front 2 feet at the bow of the boat is about horizontal. That's where we'll be working, right in here. We want that section to be horizontal, so the epoxy will not want to run away from where we want it. And we've, since it was cool in here, we used a heater, space heater. Don't get the epoxy, the deck so hot that you blister your varnish or anything though. Keep checking it. Be careful anytime you're using heat around a finish, because you get a little bit too hot and your varnish will bubble up and blister, and you'll have a whole lot of sanding to do. Okay, it might even damage the epoxy underneath. Okay, now we're going to be moving inside the boat, and adequate lighting inside will help this go smoothly. And so we have a lamp, stand-up lamp that's shining inside the boat. You can see the pole there, but a clip lamp would work well too. Okay, here we go. Now you have a decided advantage in that you're not trying to work around the camera as well, but I think this will work out okay. We'll be pouring our resin along the center line. You can see that's fairly thick because of the temperature out here. Okay. Up there. And again, the boat's probably strong enough even without this step, so don't use huge amounts of resin. And this was just what we had still left. We mixed up 6, remember, when we were doing the fiberglass cloth. And this is what's still left from that mixture. Yeah. So we're a little bit premature in hanging the fiberglass cloth on the brush, because we want the brush free to spread this resin. So we took the fiberglass cloth off. The resin has spread itself pretty nicely though, it looks like. We've got to make sure we have resin up front. Make sure there's no bare wood. Okay, that's good on that side. And along this side, now we're trying to create a bed of resin as wide as the tape and as long as the tape. Okay, just making it a little bit wider here. So we have resin underneath the tape everywhere. And no bare wood left. Is that bare wood there? Yeah, that was bare. You can see the bare wood looks a little bit lighter. Well, I'm not sure you can see, but anyway, the bare wood looks a little bit lighter in color. That should do it there pretty nicely. Good. Now we're ready for the fiberglass cloth. It'll be a little tricky to lay in, but not too bad. This is the trickiest part right here, getting it all flat and more or less centered. Okay, move that there at the end, will that part lay down. Okay, now squidge this sideways a little bit here. Slide it along. Sideways again a little more. This part looks really good up here, centered. I have to get this to slide sideways a bit. Getting there. You don't want the epoxy to be going off too quickly here, because it takes a little working to get this down. But we're getting it. Alright, just a little bit more here. We're a little bit off center, but I don't mind that. This is one little part here, we want to get that lying down, and we'll be okay. Okay, looking better now. A little bit of wrinkle. There. Almost got it. I think we're about 2 inches back from the bow, but that's plenty. That's fine. No, I wouldn't worry about that at all. Lots of strength here. You can do this whole step without the cloth too if you want. You'll still be strong enough. Okay, that's looking quite nice now. A little wrinkle here I'm working out. Bring that wrinkle all the way back off the edge of the cloth here. Okay, well, I'm very happy with that now. Voila! Last step here, looking down the center line. That is one beautiful boat. You can see it hanging there. We're just waiting for the last epoxy step to get set up. That was along the center line of the deck, and it's still positioned so that epoxy is going to stay in place till it sets up. But I just wanted to show you how gorgeous that looks. And that's just one coat of varnish. That's probably what we'll do on the bottom. We'll do another coat of varnish on the deck. but we're not going to do the traditional 8 coats of varnish sanded between each coat because we're doing an ultralight boat. And varnish, 1 coat of varnish over epoxy can give you quite a nice finish, and this finish does look spectacular. If you wanted to do a 2nd coat of varnish on the bottom, that's not a bad idea. Especially if you're not 100% pleased with your 1st coat, just sand lightly with 220 grit and do a 2nd coat on the bottom. But for the way this turned out, almost perfect. We're just going to leave the bottom the way it is now, and just another coat of varnish on the deck, and then adhere the back deck, the Mylar on the back deck, and we'll be paddling. Hopefully in just another day we'll be paddling. Can't wait. Show you. See you on the water. Okay. Very exciting to finish the epoxy processes on the boat. Okay. See you soon. Here we are. Beautiful sunshine for November. Middle of November. So terrific day. It's probably 60, 55, 60 out here. Mid-afternoon. So rather than work in the shop with synthetic lights, sunlight is always the best, so we're really enjoying this here. Last step, the back deck. We're almost paddling. We'll be paddling in no time, probably tomorrow. Okay, so sometimes good design is a result of laziness, and I'm a good example of that. I'm basically pretty lazy. So we're doing the back deck slightly differently. Rather than trim off the orange tape, we've put the orange tape on in a slightly different position. Now we've started it just inside, the inside edge of the orange tape is just inside the center line, about 1/8 of an inch inside the center line, the top, very top center line of that carbon fiber tube all the way along, and we pushed it down. So there's really not much tape on the inside. All the extra 3/8 inch orange tape is hanging out the outside. We're just going to roll that down and stick it to the boat on the outside, and figure that the decking won't roll over that far, but the black tape will cover over it. And so we're going to try this system instead of trimming the orange tape. Trimming the orange tape works fine too. And that's the way we show you in the first video. So if you do everything exactly the same as in the part 7 of the first set of videos, you'll be in great shape, but we're just trying something a little bit different this time. Okay, so we're going to push this orange tape down tight on the outside rather than trimming it off. The trimming off worked fine, but it's easier to push it down instead of trimming it off. So there we go. And so now the double-sided orange backed tape will be underneath the black vinyl tape. That should be totally compatible and not cause any problem at all. Okay, you just want to make sure the black vinyl tape comes down on the outside far enough to cover the edge of the double-sided tape. But that shouldn't be any problem because the black tape is 1/2 inch wide and the orange tape is 3/8 of an inch wide. So you have 1/8 of an inch of leeway there. And the black tape over on top will stick incredibly to the orange tape. You never get them apart. And the orange tape will stick incredibly to the hull. Okay, try to have that pushed down tight everywhere. The backing is, the orange backing is still in place everywhere, of course. Okay, there we go. Now, we're good. And there's our beautiful decking material. Amazing material. We'll make sure there's no dust on the bottom side. I have some dust on the top side. There's a little dust there. Not very much. Dust on the top doesn't really matter, but dust on the bottom will be a problem. Oh, there is dust here. Okay. So we're going to tack the whole thing. We'll get a tack rag and wipe it all off. Be back in a minute. Okay, now we've taped the front edge first with blue tape. We got all the dust off. Taped the front edge first with blue tape, and then we pulled it very straight all the way back. Taped the back edge. Not a lot to tape to there, so rub your tape on firmly. back corner there. And now we're ready to start. Remove the blue tape, lift up the front edge just enough that we can peel back the tape that's the orange backing on the double-sided tape that's across the back deck. Then we're just going to barely start the orange tape on the side decks. So we have a little bit to grab hold of there when we're ready to pull it back. We'll just pull about half an inch or an inch of that orange backing off on the sides. Not very much. I'm going to do one more thing. This is again new. It's not in the previous video. Everything there worked fine, but let's give ourselves one more alignment system here. We're going to just put a piece of tape so when I look straight down on this edge, that piece of tape is lined up exactly with the outside edge of the carbon fiber tube. So just another alignment trick there. Okay, here we go. Let's get this tape off. And this tape off. And then our backing tape. You have to be a little gentle or else your back tapes are going to release there. You don't want that to let go. Okay, one piece of orange backing off. And we're just going to roll the side backing back just enough that we'll be able to get it started easily. Just about an inch. And then fold it, crease that backing, the orange backing sharply on these side tapes. Oops, don't let it touch down yet. We're not positioned yet. Okay, there we go. Got it. Okay, so we're just back about an inch, and then we're creasing it tight. Okay, now I have my alignment on this side, and got that down. Make sure it's straight all the way back, all the way across, and tight. Okay, that looks like a good start there. I think we've got our angle just right. Push it on tight. You don't want that to come off. Okay, there we go. And now we're going to pull back our orange tape, just like in the first video. We'll pull back our orange tape to the first carbon fiber tube and press this on tight there. A little bit, rolling over the side just a teensy little bit. And then the same on this side. Oh, can I get my backing? There we go. Got it. Okay. Same on this side, just back to the first carbon fiber tube. Pull it tight across from the other side and stick it down. Isn't that nice? And again, you can roll it just over the edge just a little bit, but not very far. Okay, and then we can keep going on this side. Back to the next carbon fiber tube. Position it so it's straight, lying straight, no wrinkles or anything. Press that on tight and roll it on just a little bit over the top surface of the tube. It's not going to roll very far, it's stiff stuff. And then back to the other side, and we're doing good. Now again, pull the side tight, pull it taut from side to side, and press it on. Pull it taut before you press it on though. Okay, and we'll keep going on this side. On this side we want to pull taut so we don't have any slop in the deck. Okay, very nice. Very nice. Good. And now all the way back on this side. Almost all the way back. We're going to get this stuck back on. We're going to get our back end tape off here. A little piece of tape across the very back, because that's going to be hard to get off if we stick both sides down. There, got it. Okay. And we can take our blue tape off now. It's not going to help us anymore. And we'll pull this side off. Get this side stuck down tight. And oh, we touched down a little bit early there, but not too bad. Okay. Stretch it across tight. And now for the last little bit, pull both tapes off, and we're down. Very nice fit. Very, very nice. Okay, now we're going to roll it a little bit. You're going to find it's not going to want to stick rolled over very far though. Just curves a little bit, and that's it. And that's all you want. Just a little curve there. Now the black vinyl tape goes on top, and that's going to secure everything for us. Okay. And then we're ready to slice off the excess. And we want to be just over the edge of the material. Over the edge of the top of the carbon fiber tube. So as far as we think that material can wrap, but we don't want it sticking out in a sharp edge. So pretty much lined up, knife blade lined up parallel to the hull. And just gentle slicing, downward slicing strokes. Nice. Nice. There we go. A little extra right here. That's it. Here's the excess right here. Very sharp knife is the key to this going smoothly. Trims very easily with a sharp knife. And of course you don't have a whole roll of this, but this is far more than what we need. And actually probably a little easier to work with when you don't have as big a roll. And we're going to bring our black vinyl tape up. It's probably bring it up right to the edge of the front deck. That probably is the most consistent. And this is 1/2-inch tape. So looking down, we're going to be lining it up just about with the, if you think of a vertical line down to the inside edge of the carbon fiber tube, that's about what we'll be lining it up with. So up here at the front, it'll line up exactly right with the carbon fiber tube. Have your two thumbs right next to each other, pushing down pretty hard to get that decking, the mylar decking, which is stiff, to conform. And once it sticks down to that double-sided tape, this black vinyl tape will never release. So you want to get it right. You can slide your fingers back to press it on tight, and that's good, but don't slide them forwards because you've got to get this pressure right there with your thumbs, or else you'll get wrinkles in this black vinyl tape. There's a teensy little wrinkle. I think I can get that out though. Okay. So press everything on tight and it'll be there forever. Okay, looking very nice. Pressing down tight and get that edge of vinyl decking, of mylar decking, rolled down, held down by the vinyl tape as well as the double-sided tape. So you want to, don't just smooth that black vinyl tape on carelessly. You want to be pressing down on the decking as you smooth that vinyl tape on, the black vinyl tape. So, fair amount of pressure to get that deck to conform to that curve. Okay, going good. I think that gives you an idea of how it's going to go. You can see over here from this angle that black vinyl, and gosh, what a beautiful, look at that beautiful gleaming job on the deck up there. That is wonderful. And so just turned out beautiful. That's 2 coats of varnish on the deck now. Last detail, something you don't want to forget though. This black tape has an overlayer on it, a clear overlayer, and it pulls off. It's a little hard to get started. You have to just scrape a corner with your fingernail pretty aggressively, and you'll start to separate it. Once it starts to separate, it'll pull off quite easily. If you don't take that surface tape off at this point though, it'll get baked on, and then it'll be almost impossible to get off later. And what it does is it'll start to peel off in little pieces, and it'll lose its clarity and get kind of milky, and your black tape will never look very good after that. So you want to make sure you pull off this thin coating that's on top of the black tape. There you go, see it there? So get that off on both sides right away as soon as you get your black tape adhered. Oh, and just another note, I did like that system of extending the 3/8 inch tape from just inside the center line of the carbon fiber tube, looking straight down on it, to going over the edge, and then the black tape covering it up instead of trimming that 3/8 inch tape. That was just easier. And not to worry about tapes. They're holding critical parts of airplanes together with some of these highly advanced high-tech tapes now. So not to worry about it on your kayak. It'll last for virtually years and years. I've tried pulling some of that orange double back tape off after a year, and off of an epoxy surface, epoxy on wood surface, and rather than the tape letting go from the epoxy, the tape actually pulled chunks of epoxy off the wood. So the tape was holding on to the epoxy better than the epoxy could hold on to the wood, even though it was West system epoxy that is somewhat saturated. It was pulling off epoxy plus chunks of wood. So that orange back tape is just phenomenal. We've tested over 20 different double-sided permanent tapes, and that one is just absolutely amazing. And in the distance, you can see some interesting hardware from my steel boat projects. There's the capstan and one of the 60 pounds CQR and 200 feet of chain and some other stainless steel gear. Okay, so that's what we'll be working on next. But tomorrow we'll be paddling. Okay. It is sensational. Looks just sensational. Hope you've enjoyed the project as much as I have. It's been a real pleasure working together with you. And we'll get you out on the water tomorrow so you can see the boat paddling. Okay, have a good afternoon. Bye. Zoom in on that. 20 1/4. There it is. And just so you know, hopefully no wind comes up. Just so you know, nothing's holding it up. It is totally free floating and just barely balancing. Okay, and she's safe. And look at that, so light. Beautiful. Silver arrow, number 1.